My name is Jamie Folsom, and this is my CAA number 3 historical timeline. So to start, I started with Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. The U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education banned schools from segregation. The case found many schools guilty of unequal education. Many parents of ELL students spoke out about their children's rights. They said that if their children were involved in normal classrooms for children whose native language was English, then that meant unequal opportunities for ELL students to succeed in school. If they are in classrooms all day where no one is familiar with their native language, then they will have a difficult time learning and understanding the material. Good grades will be challenging for many ELL students were not doing well in school, and this resulted in a lot of them dropping out. The court case came to a conclusion of enforcing equal opportunity of education throughout all schools. And then next we have the National Defense Education Act of 1958. This act was passed in response to Sputnik, the satellite that demonstrated the Soviet Union's early lead in space exploration. Before this act was passed, the federal government was not very involved in education acts except for in Indian education. Um, this act provided federal funding and student loans in order for schools to receive adequate instruction to meet the needs for schools in the United States. And then next, I did the Civil Rights Act of 1964. um, also known as the Title IX Act. This act had a tremendous impact towards bilingual education. Students were able to attend public schools while receiving the appropriate and professional staff or teachers that could best help their bilingual needs. ELL students no longer had to be homeschooled and were able to attend the same schools as non-ELL students. Along with providing staff to support their needs, the staff was also required to speak to the parents of ELL students, giving them updates about their children frequently. The professional staff was required to have meaningful conversations with parents so that the parents could trust that their students were in good hands all day while at school. This act also enforced equality and fairness throughout schools. And then next we have Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. This law was known for addressing the academic needs of poor children, along with along with the National Defense Education Act of 1958. This act was involved in improving the educational opportunities for ELL students. Also similar to the National Defense Education Act, this act provided funding for bilingual education programs. This act has also taken appropriate measures to make sure that bilingual children have an equal opportunity to make good grades and to be successful in school. And then next we have the Title VII Bilingual Education Act of 1968. Texas Senator Ralph Yarborough brought attention to this bill with a goal to offer federal funding for students to be able to encourage bilingual education and programs. In 1968, the Bilingual Education Act was passed and it fell under the Title VII section under the federal laws and ESEA. Ralph Yarborough's original bill only specified for students whose native language was Spanish, but there were later another 37 similar pitches that were brought to attention by other representatives. All of these requests were included in the final bill, which led to the Children of Limited English Speaking Ability, or LESA. The original bill was very unclear, so it had to be rewritten multiple times. The Bilingual Education Act was rewritten for the final time in 1994 and remained in effect until 2002. And then next we have the Lau versus Nicole in 1970. This court case focused on the rights of language minority students in 1970. A, a lawyer in San Francisco, Edward Steinman, created this case when he learned about a child who was making poor grades in school because he could not understand the language he was being taught in. Steinman filed this case in hopes to help more than 1,700 Chinese background students who had similar stories. Steinman said, quote, "These children," he alleged, "were being denied education on equal terms because of their limited English skills." This law had a great impact and resulted in guidelines that specified in ways to identify and evaluate children with limited English skills. And then next we have the Equal Educational Opportunities Act of 1974. This act was inferred by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in Castaneda versus Pickard. Section 1703F of the EEOA demands that school districts take necessary action to overcome language obstacles that hinder equal participation by students in its instructional programs. The appellate court relied on the EEOA instead of the Lau decision to authorize the necessary support for bilingual education. The act resulted in, quote, "educational neglect violated the civil rights of language minority children, no matter if they had been victimized in deliberate discrimination." And then that leads us to the No Child Left Behind Act. This act was a major change for the bilingual education programs. This law was passed under President George W. Bush and began in 2002. The Title VII Bilingual Education Act was taken over by Title III, Language Instruction for Limited English Proficient and Immigrant Students. Noticeably, the word bilingual was removed. Beginning in 2002, ELL students were omitted from reading tests, and in 2006, their math test could also be omitted from school AYP calculations. This law was driven from 2002 to 2016. And then we have the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. This act was led by Obama administration. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act was funded over $44 billion for education. Race to the Top was part of this act, and it provided over $4 billion more in competitive grants to allow states to start education reform efforts. In order for states to become a part of this, they had to meet college and career readiness standards and have assessments that met requirements and needs for all students, including ELLs and students with disabilities. And then lastly, we have the Every Student Succeeds Act, and this was established in 2015 and is still going on today. This act was signed by President Obama and requires the standards and testing requirements to remain the same, but allows states some flexibility in establishing school accountability programs. The plans for this act were reviewed in 2017-2018 academic school year and began full implementation during the 2018-2019 school year. This act is still so new to education programs. The textbook states that it is hard to tell the impacts it will make on the education of bilingual students. And then these are my references: the Crawford textbook, the Wright textbook, and the module videos.